Around 360 BC, the Greek philosopher Plato wrote a detailed account of a powerful island civilization that had supposedly existed 9,000 years before his time, beyond a chain of mountains at the edge of the known world. He wasn't vague about it. In the Timaeus and Critias dialogues, he described a naval empire larger than Libya and Asia combined, with concentric rings of land and water, advanced architecture, and a military force powerful enough to threaten the entire Mediterranean world. According to Plato, this civilization was destroyed in a single day and night, swallowed by the ocean in what he presented not as legend, but as a matter of historical record passed down through Egyptian priests. He gave it a name, he gave it dimensions, he gave it a timeline, and yet, in over 2,000 years of archaeology, not one confirmed physical trace of it has ever been pulled out of the ground. That is the problem that has been dividing scholars for 2,400 years, and it does not have a clean resolution. On one side, you have classicists and archaeologists who argue that Plato simply invented Atlantis as a moral and political device, a cautionary tale about imperial overreach dressed up as ancient history. On the other side, you have researchers who look at the sheer specificity of what Plato wrote and find it genuinely difficult to believe the whole thing came from nowhere. Are we really supposed to accept that a philosopher invented a detailed geography, a specific timeline, and a catastrophic mechanism for destruction, and that none of it was anchored in any real event? Or are we supposed to accept that something that precise just vanished without leaving a single artifact behind? Neither answer is comfortable, and that gap between what Plato wrote and what we have ever been able to find in the ground is exactly where the argument starts. The mainstream position held by most classical scholars is essentially that Plato made it up, not randomly but deliberately as a device to make a political argument. The argument goes like this. Plato was a philosopher who constructed elaborate fictional scenarios all the time. The Ring of Gyges, the allegory of the cave, the myth of these were all invented narratives designed to carry philosophical weight. And nobody has spent 2,000 years searching for the actual cave or the actual ring. Classicists point out that Atlantis follows the exact same structural logic. It is a powerful civilization corrupted by wealth and arrogance, destroyed by divine punishment. That is not a history. That is a moral lesson with geography attached to it. There is also a silence problem that is hard to ignore. When Plato wrote about real historical events, he cited sources, he named people, he referenced documents. With Atlantis, the sourcing chain is remarkably thin. He attributes the story to an Egyptian priest who told it to the Athenian statesman Solon, who told it to his descendants, who passed it down until it eventually reached Plato. No other Greek writer from the same period ever mentions Atlantis independently. Herodotus, who travelled extensively and catalogued everything, never mentions it. Thucydides, who was meticulous about sources, never mentions it. The fact that a civilization supposedly larger than Libya and Asia combined left no trace in any other ancient record is, for most classical scholars, the clearest signal that he never existed outside of Plato's imagination. But here is where the alternative argument starts to apply real pressure. The Minoan civilization, based on the island of Crete and the surrounding Aegean, was one of the most sophisticated Bronze Age societies in the ancient Mediterranean. They built multi-story palace complexes, maintained extensive trade networks, and developed one of the earliest writing systems in Europe. Around 1600 BC, the volcanic island of Thera, located roughly 110 kilometers north of Crete, exploded in one of the largest eruptions in recorded human history. The eruption generated tsunamis across the eastern Mediterranean, buried the Minoan settlement on Thera under meters of volcanic ash, and is now linked by many archaeologists to the accelerated decline of Minoan power. The scale of what happened to the Aegean world in that period is not in dispute. The eruption is documented in ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica, in tree ring records across Europe, and in thick ash deposits found on the seafloor. Something genuinely catastrophic happened, and it happened in exactly the region where an advanced maritime civilization was operating. The question is whether Plato was, consciously or not, working from a distorted memory of that event. The parallels are difficult to dismiss entirely. Atlantis is described as a naval power with a highly organized society, destroyed suddenly and catastrophically, and swallowed by the sea. The Minoan collapse, while not a single-day event, involved the literal disappearance of an island and the subsequent deterioration of the most powerful maritime culture in the region. Some researchers argue that a story of that magnitude, traveling through oral tradition for 1,000 years before Plato wrote it down, could easily accumulate the kind of embellishments and distortions that would explain the discrepancies in scale and timeline. A regional catastrophe becomes a global one. A maritime empire becomes a superpower larger than 2 continents. It does not make any sense to treat the Thera connection as a coincidence, given how specific the structural overlap is. The problem is that the overlap is never quite specific enough to close the argument. Plato places Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which is to say, outside the Mediterranean entirely, out in the Atlantic Ocean. Thera is deep inside the Mediterranean. The timeline is off by a factor of roughly 6. Plato says Atlantis existed 9,000 years before his time, but the Thera eruption happened closer to 1,200 years before him. Supporters of the Thera hypothesis have offered explanations for both discrepancies: mistranslations, scribal errors, a confusion between Egyptian lunar and solar calendars. But each explanation requires another assumption, and the assumptions start to stack up in a way that makes the whole framework feel fragile. A separate hypothesis reaches even further back. Some researchers have pointed to geological evidence of a catastrophic flood in the Black Sea region, potentially around 5,600 BC, when rising Mediterranean waters may have breached a natural barrier and dramatically flooded what had been dry land inhabited by farming communities. The idea is that this event, rather than the Thera eruption, is the real memory behind the Atlantis account. The evidence for the Black Sea flood itself is solid. It is documented in sediment cores. Whether it was catastrophic enough to generate a civilization-ending flood myth that survived for thousands of years is considerably less clear. What both alternative hypotheses share is the same fundamental problem. They are built on pattern matching between a real event and a story that contains real elements, without a direct evidentiary link between the two. Mainstream scholars are not wrong to point that out. But they're also asking us to believe that Plato invented a story with this level of geographic and cultural specificity purely as a vehicle for a political point, and never once acknowledged that he had invented it, even in the dialogues where his own characters question whether it is real. That silence cuts both ways. So you're left choosing between a philosopher who never claimed his story was fiction and a scientific record that can't confirm the specific thing the story describes. The Sphinx sits on the Giza Plateau, and according to mainstream Egyptology, has been sitting there for roughly 4,500 years, built during the reign of the pharaoh Khafra as part of the same massive construction project that produced the second largest pyramid. That dating is not a guess. It rests on a fairly dense body of evidence: the Sphinx's physical alignment with the Khafra pyramid complex, the administrative records from the Old Kingdom period, a small granite stele erected between the Sphinx's paws that associates the monument with Khafra by name, and the stylistic consistency between the Sphinx's face and known portrait sculptures of that same pharaoh. To mainstream Egyptologists, the case is essentially closed. The Sphinx was carved around 2,500 BC, give or take a few decades, and anyone who argues otherwise is working against the weight of the entire archaeological record. And then a geologist looked at the rock. In the early 1990s, a Boston University geologist named Robert Schoch travelled to Giza specifically to study the erosion patterns on the Sphinx enclosure, which is the rectangular pit carved into the limestone bedrock in which the Sphinx sits. What he found did not match what he expected. The walls of that enclosure showed deep, rounded vertical weathering channels running down the surface. To Schoch, those patterns were instantly recognizable. That profile, undulating, vertically carved, smoothed at the edges, is the signature of prolonged water erosion caused by heavy rainfall over an extended period. It is not what you get from wind or blowing sand. Wind erosion produces horizontal striations. It scours horizontally. What Schoch was looking at on those enclosure walls had been carved from above, by water running down the face of the stone over a very long time. Here is the problem with that. Egypt has not received that kind of sustained rainfall since at least 5000 BC. Some climate models push that window back to 7000 BC, and certain interpretations of the paleoclimate data suggest the last genuinely wet period in that region ended closer to 10,000 BC. If Schoch is right about what caused the erosion, then the Sphinx enclosure was being rained on during a climate period that ended thousands of years before the Old Kingdom even existed. That would push the original carving of the monument back not centuries, but millennia, placing it somewhere in the range of 7,000 to 10,000 BC, possibly earlier. We're not talking about a modest revision to the timeline. We're talking about a civilization capable of carving a massive limestone monument at a point in human prehistory when, according to the standard model, our ancestors were still organized in small nomadic groups with no cities, no writing, and no large-scale construction of any kind. So, which is it? The argument has never been fully resolved. And the reason it hasn't is that both sides are operating with legitimate evidence that the other side cannot simply dismiss. Egyptologists push back against Schoch's interpretation on several specific grounds. First, they point out that the Sphinx's body itself shows erosion patterns consistent with wind and sand, not rain, which creates an obvious inconsistency. If the enclosure was carved by heavy rainfall, why does the statue itself not show the same profile? Second, there is no supporting archaeological evidence whatsoever for the existence of a sophisticated culture in that region at 7000 BC or earlier. No tools, no settlements, no artifacts, no administrative records, nothing that would suggest a society capable of organizing the labor required to carve the Sphinx out of bedrock. If the monument is that old, the civilization that built it left absolutely no other trace anywhere in the region. Third, the Khafra Association is not just one piece of evidence. It's a convergence of multiple dependent lines all pointing to the same period, and Schoch's hypothesis requires us to dismiss all of them without a coherent alternative explanation. Schoch's response to most of this is that absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. He acknowledges that no corroborating civilization has been found, but argues that a culture capable of building the Sphinx would not necessarily have left the same footprint as a farming settlement or a palace complex. If the monument predates any known culture, the absence of other ruins might simply reflect how little of the distant past has survived at all. He also argues that the body erosion is more complicated than it appears, partly because the Sphinx has been buried in sand for most of its existence and only fully excavated in the 20th century, meaning the wind erosion on the body accumulated across a very different time frame than the weathering on the enclosure walls. On the seismic side, Schoch and his collaborators conducted acoustic surveys of the bedrock around the Sphinx and reported evidence of subsurface cavities and erosion patterns below the water table line, which they interpreted as further evidence of ancient water infiltration on a scale inconsistent with the last 4,500 years of Egyptian climate. Egyptologists largely find the seismic data unpersuasive, or at least insufficient to override the documentary record. And that is really where the two disciplines start talking past each other in a way that is almost structural. Geologists read physical signatures in rock and use those signatures to infer climate and time. Archaeologists read human artifacts, administrative records, and architectural context to build a historical timeline. When those two methods disagree, there is no obvious referee. Each discipline considers its own methodology to be more reliable for the specific question being asked, and both have legitimate grounds for that position. A geologist is not obligated to defer to an inscription. An archaeologist is not obligated to defer to an erosion pattern, especially when that pattern could have alternative explanations. What you're left with is two coherent but incompatible readings of the same object, and no current method capable of definitively resolving which one is correct. What makes this debate so difficult to close is that both sides are using legitimate tools. One is reading the archaeological record, the other is reading the rock itself, and they are not telling the same story. On a hillside in West Java, there is a site called Gunung Padang that most visitors would describe as a large terraced pyramid covered in columnar basalt stones arranged in rough geometric patterns. The name translates roughly to Mountain of Enlightenment. And from a distance, the structure looks like a series of wide stone terraces stacked on top of one another, rising about 110 feet from the surrounding landscape. The basalt columns scattered across the surface are not naturally random. They appear arranged, stacked. In some areas, fitted together with a deliberate intentionality that caught the attention of Indonesian archaeologists decades ago. The official consensus for most of the 20th century placed its construction somewhere between 2000 and 1500 BC. That put it squarely in line with other megalithic sites spread across the Indonesian archipelago during the same general period. It was unusual, certainly worth studying, but it fit the established framework without too much difficulty. That changed when researchers started drilling. In the early 2000s, a team led by geologist Danny Hillman Natawijaja began conducting subsurface investigations at the site using core sampling, ground-penetrating radar. Radiocarbon dating of organic material recovered from deeper layers. What came back from the laboratory was not what anyone expected. The upper terraces and surface columns confirmed the 2000 to 1500 BC range that archaeologists had already established. But as the cores went deeper, the dates started moving in a direction that made the results genuinely difficult to process. Organic material from the third layer down returned dates in the range of 7,500 to 10,000 BC. Material from the deepest layers that the team claimed showed evidence of construction returned dates as far back as 25,000 BC. If those numbers were accurate, and if the material surrounding them was genuinely the product of human construction, rather than natural geological formation, then Gunung Padang would be the oldest large-scale constructed site ever discovered anywhere on Earth by an enormous margin. It would predate Göbekli Tepe by roughly 15,000 years. It does not make any sense whatsoever to slot that into the standard timeline of human development, without completely rethinking what we know about the cognitive and organizational capabilities of people living during the last ice age. The mainstream response from geologists and archaeologists was pointed and fairly unified. The core objection was not necessarily with the radiocarbon dates themselves, but with what those dates were actually measuring. Gunung Padang sits on top of an ancient volcanic formation. Critics argued that the deeper material the team was dating was not artificially constructed fill, but naturally occurring volcanic rock and compacted soil. Radiocarbon dating requires organic material. When you pull organic samples from deep within a volcanic landscape, you may simply be dating ancient plant matter or carbon that became naturally incorporated into geological layers over millennia. The dating methodology, several critics argued, was being applied to material that had no proven connection to human activity. A group of Indonesian and international geologists published a pointed response contending that what Nathawijaja's team interpreted as constructed chambers and deliberately shaped columns at depth were consistent with the natural columnar jointing that volcanic basalt routinely produces as it cools. Basalt columns that look geometric are actually a well-documented geological phenomenon. The terrifying part of this counterargument is how reasonable it sounds. This was because it essentially removes the anomaly without needing to explain it. The alternative interpretation, held by Nathawijaja and a smaller number of supporting researchers, is that the site was constructed in multiple distinct phases across an enormous span of time, with each era of builders adding to what previous generations had left behind. In this framework, the upper surface reflects the most recent construction phase from the late megalithic period. But the deeper core of the hill contains deliberately engineered foundations from a far earlier epoch. Proponents point to specific features in the core samples that they argue cannot be explained by natural volcanic processes alone, including what they describe as cavities and structured voids at depth that would not form spontaneously in cooling lava. They also note that the chemical composition and density of certain subsurface layers appears inconsistent with a purely natural formation. Are these genuinely the fingerprints of human engineering? Or are they the kinds of patterns that a motivated researcher starts to see once they have already formed a hypothesis? That is exactly the problem, and it sits at the center of why this argument has not resolved. What makes Gunung Padang particularly difficult to assess is that the physical evidence at the surface is genuinely unambiguous. Someone built something there. The upper terraces and the arrangement of the basalt stones represent real human work. The dating on that surface layer is not contested. The argument is entirely about what lies beneath. The two sides are not really disagreeing about the numbers that came back from the laboratory. They are disagreeing about what those numbers describe. One side says the radiocarbon dates are measuring constructed fill placed by people. The other says the same dates are measuring natural material that was never touched by human hands. Both interpretations are consistent with the raw data. That is why neither side has been able to land a decisive blow. This leads to a more fundamental question that no drill core can fully resolve on its own. When you find an unusual shape deep inside a volcanic hill, how do you determine whether it was made or merely formed? The tools for answering that question are still being argued over. The peer review process around this site has been contentious enough that the journal which originally published part of the team's findings later issued a retraction notice over concerns about the methodology. That retraction added more heat without producing more clarity. We're likely missing something fundamental about how to interpret subsurface sites like this one, where geology and archaeology are essentially competing to describe the same physical reality using different languages. The core question, whether those lower layers are the remnants of a constructed foundation or just a volcanic hill that humans later built on top of, is still genuinely open. The answer changes everything about what the site means. The broadest version of this argument isn't really about one site or one document. It's a claim about the entire shape of human history. Everything we've looked at so far, the contested layers beneath Gunung Padang, the deep weathering on the Sphinx enclosure, the astronomical precision buried inside Sumerian mathematical records, these aren't just isolated puzzles. For a growing number of researchers, they form a pattern. The hypothesis is this, that somewhere before the Younger Dryas period, that ran from roughly 12,800 to 11,600 years ago, a civilization of meaningful sophistication existed, was erased by a catastrophic event, left behind only fragments that we keep filing away as anomalies instead of reading as evidence. That is a sweeping claim, and the question of whether it holds up depends almost entirely on how you weigh what we have found against what we haven't. The mainstream position from archaeologists and historians is not dismissive so much as it is methodical. When you map the actual archaeological record, what you see is a continuous, gradual accumulation of human complexity. Stone tools become more refined over tens of thousands of years. Settlement patterns expand slowly. Agricultural techniques emerge in multiple places independently across a few thousand years. There is no layer in the record where sophisticated technology appears without precedent. There is no sudden gap followed by a civilization rebuilding from scratch. The standard model treats human development as a long, uneven, but ultimately traceable climb, and when you follow the physical evidence, that climb is well documented. Proponents of that view will also point out that the ocean floor, coastal shelves, riverbeds that were exposed during the last ice age and then submerged as sea levels rose have been extensively surveyed. We have not found the ruins of cities, ports, or infrastructure at scale. That absence matters, but here is where the alternative perspective pushes back, and it does so with some specificity. The case isn't built on the absence of ruins. It's built on the presence of things that are harder to explain than the standard timeline comfortably allows. The precision embedded in certain ancient structures, the kind of mathematical encoding we described in the Sumerian king list with its base 60 system, and its apparent alignment with the 25,920-year precession of the equinoxes, the global distribution of flood narratives that share not just a theme, but specific structural elements, a divine warning, a vessel, a reset of the human population. Taken individually, each of these can be rationalized away. Taken together, some researchers argue, they suggest that certain ancient cultures were working from a body of knowledge that didn't originate with them. The question is where that knowledge came from, whether the civilization that developed it left anything we could actually identify as physical proof. The coherence of these patterns is what drives the alternative view forward. It's not mere speculation divorced from data, but rather a reinterpretation of existing data through a different temporal lens. Researchers who support this perspective have conducted rigorous statistical analysis on flood narratives across cultures, demonstrating that the similarities exceed what random chance would predict. The astronomical knowledge embedded in monuments and texts shows an internal consistency that seems difficult to attribute to independent discovery alone. This is where it becomes important to separate two things that often get collapsed into each other. There is the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis. That is a legitimate scientific debate happening inside peer-reviewed geology and physics journals. A cluster of researchers, including geologists, physicists, climate scientists, have argued since around 2007 that the onset of the Younger Dryas cooling period was triggered or accelerated by a comet impact or airburst event over the Laurentide ice sheet. The evidence they cite includes a layer of platinum and iridium anomalies found at Younger Dryas boundary sites across multiple continents, nanodiamonds, spherules, other markers associated with high-temperature cosmic events. This hypothesis is contested, and it is contested by other scientists, using the same methodological standards. It is not fringe theory. It is an active argument among specialists about what caused a climate event we know happened. The researchers proposing this hypothesis understand that they are working against a long-standing consensus, but they argue that the evidence itself is what should drive interpretation. They point to instances where the scientific establishment has revised its understanding of major climatic events once new methods revealed what older techniques had missed. The point is not that consensus is always wrong, but that evidence should remain open to reinterpretation when new data emerges. The speculative leap, and this is where mainstream science draws the line, is connecting that impact event to the destruction of an advanced human civilization. The Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis, even if it is fully confirmed, does not by itself imply that a sophisticated society existed beforehand and was wiped out. Those are two separate claims requiring two separate bodies of evidence. So far, only one of them has a serious scientific argument behind it. What the impact hypothesis does do, if it holds, is establish that a genuinely catastrophic event struck the Earth at roughly the same moment that numerous Ice Age megafauna went extinct, and that human populations in certain regions appear to have contracted sharply. Something happened. The disagreement is about what was lost in it. It does not make any sense whatsoever to assume that the absence of ruins settles the question cleanly. Coastal civilizations built on shorelines that were later submerged by 300 feet of ocean water would be extraordinarily difficult to locate and excavate. We have only surveyed a fraction of the relevant seafloor with the resolution required to identify structural remains. That's not a conspiracy, it's a logistical reality. At the same time, we have to be honest about what the alternative model actually requires. For a pre-Younger Dryas civilization to have reached a level of sophistication capable of producing the kind of mathematical and astronomical knowledge that shows up in early Mesopotamian records, it would need to have left behind something more than thematic echoes in mythology and numerical patterns in ancient texts. We're missing something fundamental if such a civilization existed at scale. This was because civilizations at scale produce waste, infrastructure, material culture on a level that tends to survive. The honest answer is that the absence of evidence and the evidence of absence are not the same thing. The distinction between those two is where this debate actually lives. In 1994, a Kurdish shepherd in southeastern Turkey noticed something unusual about a hillside near the town of Şanlıurfa. It was covered in unusually shaped stones that turned out, after excavation, to be the tops of 11,000-year-old carved limestone pillars buried under several meters of fill. The archaeologist Klaus Schmidt arrived shortly after and immediately understood that something was wrong with the timeline. Not wrong in the sense of an error, but wrong in the sense that what he was looking at should not have been possible, given everything the academic world thought it knew about early human civilization. The site is called Göbekli Tepe, which translates roughly as Potbelly Hill, and the name gives almost no indication of what is actually there. The pillars are T-shaped, carved from solid limestone, and some of them stand nearly 20 feet tall and weigh up to 10 tons. They are arranged in circular enclosures, positioned in pairs at the center with smaller pillars ringing the walls, and their surfaces are covered in detailed animal reliefs: foxes, vultures, scorpions, wild boar, lions, carved with a precision that takes real skill and sustained effort to produce. There are at least 20 enclosures identified so far, and only a fraction of the site has been excavated. The radiocarbon dates are not disputed. Göbekli Tepe was being actively constructed around 9,600 BC, which places it roughly 7,000 years before Stonehenge, and more than 6,000 years before the earliest Egyptian pyramid. Here is the problem that every archaeologist who visits this site has to confront. The people who built it were hunter-gatherers. There is no evidence of permanent settlement at the site itself, no storage facilities for grain, no domesticated animal bones in the early layers, no pottery. The standard model of civilization had always assumed a specific sequence. Farming comes first, then surplus food, then permanent settlements, then the social organization and free labor that makes monumental construction possible. Göbekli Tepe was built entirely before any of that existed in this region. There is no way to reconcile this with the old sequence if you hold rigidly to conventional thinking. The mainstream interpretation, broadly accepted among archaeologists who study the site, is that Göbekli Tepe was a ritual or ceremonial gathering place, not a city, not a settlement, but a location where dispersed hunter-gatherer communities converged periodically, possibly for feasting, ancestor veneration, or communal religious activity. The physical evidence supports this in certain ways. There are no domestic structures, no hearths arranged for daily cooking, no evidence of year-round habitation. What there is a massive investment of collective labor in a location that appears to have been treated as sacred rather than functional. In this reading, the site is extraordinary but not inexplicable. Groups of hunter-gatherers were capable of coordination and symbolic thinking. Göbekli Tepe is simply the most dramatic physical expression of that capacity we've ever found. But even within mainstream archaeology, the site has cracked open a debate that was already simmering. Did organized religion precede agriculture, or did agriculture come first and create the conditions for organized religion? For most of the 20th century, the default assumption was that farming drove everything else. Settle down, grow food, build institutions, develop cosmology. Göbekli Tepe reverses that arrow entirely, or at least makes you question it. Some researchers now argue that the drive to gather at a sacred site, to maintain and expand it, to keep coming back over generations, may have been what pushed people toward cultivating plants in the surrounding area. The earliest evidence of domesticated wheat comes from regions close to Göbekli Tepe. That might not be a coincidence. See. The terrifying part of that implication is that it means the spiritual and symbolic world of early humans may have been the engine that produced civilization, not a product of it. This is where the alternative interpretations start to pull the debate in a different direction. Some researchers look at Göbekli Tepe and see not just an early ceremonial site, but evidence of a level of social complexity in pre-agricultural societies that the mainstream has consistently and dramatically underestimated. To quarry, transport, and erect these pillars, to carve them with consistent iconographic systems, to maintain the site across what appears to be centuries of use, you need sustained organization, shared symbolic frameworks, and something resembling institutional memory. That is not the picture of scattered, improvised bands of foragers that has dominated the popular understanding of pre-agricultural life. Some scholars connected to the broader lost civilization hypothesis have gone further, arguing that Göbekli Tepe represents a remnant of organizational knowledge that originated even earlier, in a period before the Younger Dryas, and that the people who built it were drawing on traditions far older than the site itself. The mainstream response is that there is no physical evidence of anything earlier, and that inferring a lost predecessor civilization from a single site is a leap that the data does not justify. Both of those positions are defensible, and they remain in genuine tension. What no one disputes is what happened next. Around 8000 BC, someone deliberately filled the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe with rubble and buried the entire site. This was not gradual abandonment. It was intentional, organized, and thorough. The pillars were covered, the enclosures sealed, and then the hill was left. Why would a community that had invested extraordinary effort in constructing this place then methodically entomb it? We do not know. Some researchers suggest a ritual closure, a deliberate ending of one era and beginning of another. Others wonder if the burial was protective, a way of preserving the site from something. The fact that the burial is also the reason the site survived in such extraordinary condition is one of the more disorienting ironies in all of ancient history. Whatever the motivation was, it has not left any obvious trace in the record. Each new excavation season at Göbekli Tepe tends to produce findings that complicate the existing interpretations rather than resolve them. New enclosures, new iconographic details, new evidence about the sequence of construction and use. None of it has cleanly confirmed any single theory about what the site was for or what kind of social structure produced it. The argument about whether religion preceded agriculture is no closer to a resolution. The question of whether Göbekli Tepe represents an isolated peak of early complexity or one visible node in a broader pattern we haven't yet located remains genuinely open. What makes Göbekli Tepe so resistant to a clean answer is that it doesn't just challenge one theory. It sits at the intersection of almost every major open question about how and why human civilization began, and so far the site has answered very few of them.